Dear students, in continuation of the previous video on government budget and economy, today we are coming to the concluding part. We'll see the types of budget. You can see on your screen there are two types of budgets. First, we call balanced budget. The balanced budget means when the government's receipts are equal to the government's expenditure. Whether receipts are coming from revenue receipts or capital receipts, and the expenditure is whether revenue expenditure or capital expenditure, both must be equal. We call it a balanced budget. It has got certain merits. First, in a balanced budget, there would be no wasteful expenditure. Expenditure would always be developmental expenditure. It would not be wastage. Second, a balanced budget ensures financial stability of the country, of the economy. The second type of budget is unbalanced budget. The unbalanced budget can be of two types. First, surplus budget. Surplus budget means a budget in which government has more receipts and less expenditure. Estimated government receipts are greater than estimated government expenditure. That we call the surplus budget. The other kind of unbalanced budget is deficit budget. So the deficit budget means a budget in which government's estimated expenditure is more than estimated receipts. So that is deficit budget. So we'll see now that because there is no point of studying much about the balanced budget. It's a statement of receipts and expenditure, very clear. But this unbalanced budget needs further study. So this budget deficit is studied under three heads. There are three types of deficit budgets. You can see on your screen, graph is shown. First is revenue deficit, second is fiscal deficit, and the third one is primary deficit. So let's understand them. Revenue deficit, it means what? It means when the revenue receipt of the government is less than revenue expenditure. That means revenue deficit is equals to revenue expenditure minus revenue receipt. That is revenue deficit. It has nothing to do with the capital one. Next deficit budget is fiscal deficit. What does it mean? It is estimated for both the revenue as well as capital receipts and the expenditure of the government. It is based on both estimations, revenue as well as capital. So this fiscal deficit means when there is total expenditure is more than total receipt. But one condition, excluding borrowings, other than borrowings. Borrowings would be excluded. Then that kind of budget would be termed as fiscal deficit. So fiscal deficit means total expenditure minus total receipts, excluding borrowings, minus borrowings. That is fiscal deficit. The third kind of deficit budget is primary deficit budget. Primary deficit. Primary deficit means fiscal deficit minus interest payments of loans. The payments which we do of the loans, that is subtracted from fiscal deficit, that we call the primary deficit. There's another term for this deficit budget which is coming, gross fiscal deficit. How do we go for this gross? In total. Gross fiscal deficit means in that one we go for the borrowings from RBI plus borrowings from the abroad and the borrowings from home. So from wherever we are doing the borrowings, that is included in that gross fiscal deficit. In that fiscal deficit, borrowings, other than borrowings we were saying, so that means that is gross fiscal deficit. In that one, all these borrowings are included. Now once the deficit budget is presented by the government, then how do they manage? It's an important question. But how government manages the deficit budget? So for that there are three ways by which the government manages the deficit budget. The first one is known as monetary expansion. The first method by which the deficit budget is handled, is managed, that is by monetary expansion. It means this method simply implies printing of currency notes to the extent of the deficit. Whatever the deficit is there, those many currency notes would be published by the government. How they are done? With the help of the RBI. And how RBI decides? On the basis of our stock of gold in International Monetary Fund. Accordingly, those many more currency notes can be printed. So this is one of the way by which the budget deficit is managed. The other way is disinvestment. The government may raise loans from the general public by issuing bonds of various types. From the bank through post offices, government can raise the loans, and in those loans what happens? The public debt interest, these loans increase the burden of this public debt interest over the government. The third method is again disinvestment, or we can call it privatization. In this third one, in the second one, which was disinvestment, there only government is what? Is giving a bond and getting the revenue from the government, from the public. But in the third one kind of disinvestment, which is privatization, the public sector undertakings are sold to the private players. This is also the way the government is handling this budget deficit. Now government has handled. Now the question comes, what are its implications when the government goes for the deficit budgets? The deficit budgets are being managed. How? They are being managed by monetary expansion, by disinvestment, by privatization. But what are the implications of this fiscal deficit? First, we'll study of the revenue deficit. When government has the revenue deficit, what are its implications? What are its effects? Revenue deficit It indicates the inability of the government to meet the regular and recurring expenditure in the proposed budget. High revenue deficit gives a warning to the government either to cut its expenditure or increase its tax or non-tax receipts. So somehow, the revenue deficit is there, government needs more revenue. How? There are only two ways. Either they have to reduce their expenditure or they need to increase their revenue. How? By increasing the tax rates or by increasing the non-tax receipts. In less developed countries like India, often the situation rises when the government is to incur huge expenditure on administration, and it is also difficult to force the people to pay high taxes. This problem keeps coming, revenue deficit problem. So it's not like government has to do a lot of expenditure and administration and they can't force the people to pay higher taxes. In such a situation, the government is compelled. Now, how government manages revenue deficit? Its implication is what? The government goes for the situation for borrowing or disinvestment. So, government has to either go for one of the borrowings or for the disinvestment. And what is its implication? Suppose government has gone for one of the solution of borrowing. So, by borrowing, the liability of the government has increased. And by disinvestment, the assets have reduced. So it's a very tactful thing to handle the revenue deficit. And the whole financial system has to be checked. Otherwise, a kind of whole economy can become destabilized. So this can be one of the implication we have gone for the revenue deficit. When we come for the fiscal deficit, now what are its implications? Fiscal deficit implications. There are four broad implications of fiscal deficit. First, it causes inflation. Government mainly borrows from Reserve Bank of India. This means that there is printing of more currency notes to meet deficit requirements of the government. This is also known as deficit financing. And because of more currency notes in circulation, what happens? The inflation rate becomes higher. Germany was the first country in the world which suffered this inflation the very first time. So this is one of the implication of this fiscal deficit. It increases the inflation. Second, growing indebtedness. Government borrows from rest of the world, which raises its dependence on other countries. There is economic and political interference by the lender countries. That too is one of the implications. For managing that fiscal deficit, you have to borrow. You take the money from the other countries, and then the other countries start interfering in your economic and political setup. That too is one of the challenge for the integrity of the country. So that too requires quite tactful approach. Foreign policy has to be good. Diplomacy is required for that. The third kind of implementation is reduces future growth and development. Borrowings is a financial burden on future generations to repay loans and interest amount. It retards future growth and development prospects of the country. This is also one of the very severe implication of the fiscal deficit. The future generation will suffer because in legacy we are going to leave lot of loans and the repayment of the loans or the interest on them. So by this way, the growth and development, because ultimately all the economic activities are governed towards increasing the size of the GDP. But because of this fiscal deficit, the GDP size would be hampered. The future generations will suffer. They will have to pay the cost for them. And the fourth implication of fiscal deficit is, that is debt trap. In order to pay huge interest amount, the government has to take further loans. A vicious circle sets in wherein the government takes more loans to repay earlier loans. The country is caught in a debt trap. We are knowing that our neighboring country is suffering because of this debt trap. The economy is collapsed. If you keep taking the loans for paying the previous loan, again you take the loan for paying the next loan, so what's happening? You're trapped. You're never able to come out of that. In Indian economy, the next chapter which we have to study, that is poverty. So poverty is a kind of trap. It's a vicious circle in which people are engaged. The same way, once the fiscal deficit continues for the long time, we don't increase our resources, we don't improve our productivity, so we have to carry this load of fiscal deficit. It converts into debt trap. So this all we have covered about government budget and the economy. Listen the videos very clearly, attentively, make your notes, understand, go for the concepts and make yourself good. Thank you.